This is the house I was talking about. These people are suffering. There's no heat. Sewage is backed up. Rats are crawling in, scratching at the kids at night. It's horrible. I don't know how anybody can live like this.
That's how my floor's been since probably as long as I can remember. It was renovated and then it's like that now.
So something's given way underneath the house.
The floor beam. This is my good old wood stove.
And this is, if it's not for this, you don't have...
I have no heat.
There's nothing.
There are 9 of us living here in this house, and there are only 3 bedrooms. If you do get a house, you feel like a king, you feel like a queen because you got lucky.
The burnt marks, when there was a shack fire right here a few months ago, David Papazzi's shack, these almost caught on fire, and they got lucky.
Home is where the heart is, our refuge from the rest of the world. But that old saying doesn't take into account that for many living in First Nations communities, home is also a place of hopelessness and heartbreak.
When she had her surgery, they told us that it was like a 50-50 chance for her because it was a high risk.
13-year-old Sheridan Hukama spent her entire life sick from living in this overcrowded, mold-infested house.
She would always draw pictures of me and her in a house, like a dream house for her, and a healthy family.
Like too many First Nations children, Sheridan felt hopeless and took her own life.
First of all, there's depression and a sense of a lack of worth and value in your community, and a lack of, it's almost a sense of total exclusion within your own community.
Daryl Williams is a retired doctor. He's seen too often the effects of bad housing.
Talk to the health issues, everything from TB to potentially fatal bacterial or viral infections, constant colds, influenza, everything to do with cold temperatures constantly coming through windows and doors. It's a shameful state to have somebody have to live in. I think it must cause a great deal of sort of medical depressive issues in people. If this was in the white man's territory in Canada, no one would stand for it.
It's not news that First Nations are gripped by a housing crisis. For decades, the federal government has tried to figure it out. The Liberals came with a housing policy in 1996 that was supposed to be a fix-all. It promised greater flexibility, more control to First Nations, and also more money. $160 million in additional funds were to be provided. Sounded nice. But 7 years later, Auditor General Sheila Fraser blasted the feds for a critical shortage of adequate housing to accommodate a young, growing on-reserve population, despite nearly $4 billion being spent. Fraser blamed Indian Affairs and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, also First Nations themselves, all for failing to understand their role in fixing the problem. Fast forward 8 more years, 2011. Aboriginal Affairs re-evaluates its 1996 housing program and finds not only is it still not working, but that the shortfall still exists and appears to be growing. And the result is overcrowding, 6 times higher than among other Canadians. The report went on to say with an existing backlog and forecasted rise in population, new needs are being generated as quickly as the housing can be built. By 2013, the Senate feels it's time that they get involved. They travel coast to coast for 2 full years and in the end conclude that indeed there are severe housing shortages and overcrowding, also poorly constructed housing in serious disrepair. And here we are, 2017.
What you need to really understand about the Department of Indian Affairs, and in fact any federal response to a First Nation community, if there's a 4-point response team to an emergency. Number 1, ignore it. Number 2, if it doesn't go away, continue to ignore it. Number 3, initiate a study. And then number 4, go back to number 1 and repeat the process. And then blame the communities.
He's the Member of Parliament for Timmins, James Bay in Northern Ontario. He used YouTube to draw the world's attention to Attawapiskat.
How many people are in here? Six. Four kids. Wow. No electricity?
They're running an extension cord from next door.
Right. And no water? No, of course no water. No washroom. So people living in these shacks? Yeah. For a child would be And we brought a little camera. I didn't even know if the camera worked. I just bought it. I hadn't even had a chance to practice it. But I knew that nobody would believe the conditions were that bad unless we had video footage.
Be burned to the ground in about a half an hour.
I know. Look at this heat and this, like that there. I mean, open in the back, that heat, they'd never get out.
First Nations housing was a thorn in the side of the Conservative government.
Where is this plan to guarantee that these people will be moved into safe, proper housing with a long-term plan? Where is that plan?
The hoopla spurred then Attawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence to stage a 6-week-long hunger strike on Parliament Hill. Her community's housing horrors quickly took a back seat to how she did or didn't perform as chief.
Well, Teresa Spence was entirely targeted. Indian Affairs has a long history of targeting and scapegoating communities that speak up, but what happened to Teresa Spence was, I think, very ugly. What happened in Attawapiskat was completely uncalled for, not worthy of the dignity of a first world nation to leave people in such precarious states. And if the Red Cross hadn't moved in, if Canadians across the country hadn't stepped up, people would have died that winter.
The First Nations housing crisis barely got its 15 minutes of fame back then. 6 years later, a new government promising new money, $550 million over 2 years to build 3,000 homes and renovate many others. But critics say it's just a drop in the bucket, if it even materializes.
I think for the longest time, Canadians probably just didn't believe this situation existed. I think Canadians are getting their eyes opened, but what they probably find really hard to believe is that governments just don't seem to make it as a priority.
All the political wrangling in the world is not helping people like Melinda McIver. She has to live in that home we showed you earlier on the Sandy Bay First Nation, near Portage la Prairie, Manitoba.
It's just all sewage.
Yeah, all that way, all the way down.
Failed plumbing is just one of the home's problems.
This is the washroom on the inside there.
The family of 10 that crams in here recently grew to 11.
All of us are always getting sick because of this. Yeah, especially the rat, because I was sleeping in the living room and he bit my finger. Yeah, and I got up fast. I was sleeping with my baby and this one, that time. And I have to jump fast, chasing that big rat, chilly big rat though.
There's no shortage of dangerous homes here. As our news crew was leaving, this grandmother flagged us down to show us another.
It was raining and the whole roof came down and look what they put on there.
Here's the outside fix for that collapsed roof. A tarp.
According to the Assembly of First Nations, Indigenous communities face overcrowding rates 6 times higher than that of other Canadians. 50% of houses are filled with mold. 70% need major repairs. And new statistics from that agency say that it's about to get way worse.
To become an epidemic proportion in the next couple of years unless we have some real concrete solutions. You know, we need to build tens of thousands of homes each and every year, not a few hundred to 1,000.
The Assembly of First Nations has been documenting the housing crisis and lobbying governments for decades. Manitoba Regional Chief Kevin Hart currently has the housing portfolio. He joined us here at APTN to discuss.
And he didn't come bearing good news.
So what are the latest numbers that you have in terms of the shortage of houses?
We're short 175,000 homes in this country. If there isn't any real investments done immediately, it's going to reach epidemic proportions in, I believe, in the next few years.
It was only a few years ago that number was pegged at 85,000 homes. But don't forget, an estimated 70% of on-reserve houses back then were found to be in need of repairs. Many of those weren't fixed and are now uninhabitable. Add to that a growing population, and it's not hard to see how the shortage has grown to 175,000.
Resources aren't there to catch up with the need. Even on the renovation part, we are seeing houses where they're only lasting maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, and then they get condemned. The list is endless of how, our housing in our First Nations is so deficient.
Why, though? Why are these homes only lasting a decade when century-old houses in urban centers last long enough to become charming character homes? Why are reserve houses so prone to mold? Let's address the mold first.
That some of the places that our First Nations are situated on are some of the most, how would you say it? We were placed there by government in some of the most opportune spots. Some of the land is water saturated, some of the worst land that our people have been put on. So.
And that leads to the mold problem too.
Oh yes, absolutely. In the spring, given that the, our houses are built under code and such from 20, 30 years ago, and then you see them now, they're built below standard. They're built with substandard material. If you look at some of the houses on the First Nations,
it's a big problem. But what's the solution?
We have 634 First Nations, and if we build maybe 2 or 3 homes a year per First Nation, that's only 1,800, 2,000 homes being built in any given year. Now, if you look at 175,000 homes short, and the number growing and growing each year with the increase of our population, you could see that we're being set up for failure right off the bat.
Okay, but look at how many billions Ottawa has spent on First Nations housing, government after government, over the past couple decades. The latest promise, $550 million in the next 2 years. Why hasn't all this money fixed the problem?
Because the bureaucracy eats up 58 cents on each and every dollar. 58 cents. So 42 cents on the dollar reaches the First Nation.
First Nations have long complained that the amount government announces for programs and housing isn't the actual amount they ever see by the time it winds through Ottawa's bureaucracy. And what's left is hardly enough to fill the void, never mind getting ahead. Here's the kicker. If a First Nation comes up with its own money for housing, say through profits from economic development, they're bound by Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation rules that limit what they can and can't do.
A First Nation has own sourced revenue where they build their own homes out of own source revenue. They're not allowed to charge rent or social allowance on those homes. And why is that? I don't know. So when the First Nation leadership can't charge shelter allowance on those homes, it puts the First Nation further and further into debt where there's no O&M maintenance or anything being charged.
Those Senate and Auditor General reports highlighted the roadblocks set up by Indigenous Affairs and the CMHC, but nothing's changed.
I don't see the housing situation in First Nations being addressed in my lifetime.
Member of Parliament Charlie Angus can understand why. He filed a Freedom of Information request for the government's inventory of reserve housing. He hoped to see where the shortage hotspots are and just how bad the situation really is. What he got was 400 mostly redacted pages. What was left was just the First Nation's name and its address.
When they black out information about housing, or they black out information about what they're spending in schools, that tells me that they're lying to the Canadian people, and that's not acceptable. Canadians have a right to know what the plans are, and Canadians have a right to know what exactly the extent of the crisis is.
There's a growing number of people like Flower Dockstader who gave up waiting for a plan out of Ottawa. The Six Nations grandmother lived here for 30 years. With the help and hard work of others, last summer she upgraded to a home made of mud and recycled bottles and tires. It's called an Earthship, and it's touted as a radically sustainable way of living. It's the brainchild of this New Mexico architect.
Well, I looked around in the world and see people spending a lot of money for fuel and devastating the planet for fuel and still being cold and not having enough water, and I see the problems. And so I started just making solutions to those problems for myself.
They're made of natural and upcycled materials. thermal and solar heated and cooled, solar and wind powered, and have contained sewage treatment, water harvesting, and even food production. They rely minimally, if at all, on public utilities or fossil fuels.
To be off the grid and that, like, yeah, gonna have to, tone down our living ways and that, and be easy on the water, stuff like that. But hey, it's worth it.
Folks near Winnipeg and Prince Albert in northern Saskatchewan are proving earthships can handle the prairie's extreme cold, a must for reserve housing. And the cost? $70,000 for this one. So about half the price of your average on-reserve build. These folks learned to build one on Six Nations. They now have the know-how to build more for the community. Alternative solutions are popping up elsewhere too. Homes made from old shipping containers are an affordable new trend in eco-living.
People like CP Rail and CN Rail, I've reached out to them and they've expressed some interest on doing some pilots in some First Nations and such.
Habitat for Humanity partnered with the Flying Dust First Nation in Saskatchewan to build a 10-unit elders complex.
It's great to have partners like for Habitat for Humanity.
And most recently, a family in Tubik, New Brunswick, helped build their Habitat home. Hart wants to see it continue. A Long Plain First Nation near Portage La Prairie is getting crafty to address their housing shortage.
We have to change. The status quo is not working in terms of First Nations housing on reserves, and we have to leave, I think, a new housing agenda for our children and grandchildren, because we can't continue the way we're going because it's just costing way too much money.
This community has several profitable businesses that subsidize housing, but Chief Misha says that it's not sustainable.
We recognize that we need to go into homeownership on our First Nation community, and we need to transfer that responsibility to our working people, and to be able to own their own homes, own their lots. That's the move afoot for Long Plain First Nation.
He's making it happen through the First Nations Market Housing Corporation, a $300 million fund set up by the Harper government to encourage home ownership on reserve. There was little uptake, but Misha sees the benefit.
We're trying to put the onus on our people to take home ownership and be responsible for their homes and just have legal title to the homes. I think one of the best housing development sites in the province of Manitoba with Kishkimikwa Housing, and we have 39 lots there right now, actually more than 39 lots, and we're expanding. So there's a real desire for Long Plain First Nations people to live in the city of Portage on our urban reserve.
Unfortunately, Long Plain is in the minority of tapping into the fund.
The First Nations Market Housing Fund that was established in 2008. It was set up to build 25,000 homes in 10 years. It's 2017 now, and to date they've only realized maybe about 200 loans versus 25,000 homes that were supposed to build in 10 years. They got a year to go and they've only realized 200 loans. So that $300+ million First Nation Market Housing Fund that's sitting there is grossly mismanaged, and it's clearly underachieved the results that it was supposed to have done in the first place.
Hart believes the housing crisis is unique to each First Nation, and so must be the solutions.
It can't be one blanket solution because, north and south are different. Climate is different, but we have remote communities, we have drive-in and fly-in communities, and in the south we have accessible communities. It takes our government partners to take a step back and to listen to us as First Nation people and leaders to say, these are the solutions we have when it comes to addressing the housing needs in our communities and such.
It's such an important issue, he wants to see housing addressed specifically in the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, because overcrowding can be a particularly unsafe environment for them.
The vulnerable get exploited or else be abused or be victims of violence and such, and that, for us as leaders, we want to ensure that the safety of our women and our girls is first and foremost.
The Assembly of First Nations held a housing conference last fall to connect desperate leaders with businesses that may have solutions. Daryl Williams was there. When he retired from practicing medicine, he got into the little side business building houses, in part because of the health problems he saw caused by substandard and overcrowded housing. Remember Chief Hart saying reserve homes were built well below minimum standards? Well, even those in the industry know it.
Shoddy workmanship, shoddy construction, inappropriate parts being supplied to the contract. It's a shameful expose on the construction industry.
And adding insult to injury?
We know what it costs to make a house for this industry. We know also what companies have been charging. And it's my considered opinion that generally speaking, there's gouging going on. It's okay to make a fair profit. No one's going to argue with somebody making a profit. They realize you have to feed your kids at home and so forth. But the profit, in my opinion, is horrific. If anyone knew exactly what amount of money people are making selling a house to a First Nation property versus what it truly costs, the actual cost, it's shameful.
But it's happened under every government, unchecked. Ottawa keeps writing checks and hoping the problem will go away. The state of what's being built suggests it's not. As for the $550 million for reserve housing this year and next,
I mean, the latest plan that the Trudeau government's come up for housing, I mean, it's a joke. On reserve, by lottery tickets, you got a better chance of winning the lottery than you do of actually getting a house in Canada.
interestingly, Melinda McIver kind of did win the lottery. Remember her?
The insulation inside it there, there's lots of rats there too. Yeah. In the middle of the night, you can hear them make too much noise, eh?
Well, the YouTube video of her house hit the news when Williams happened to be in town for that housing conference.
I was just shocked. I was horrified to think that somebody would be forced to live in that kind of a condition and sense of hopelessness to how to find a way out.
He decided then and there he'd donate a house like this to the McIver family.
So now to the wall. See how thick this is?
Mm-hmm.
In your wildest imagination, do you think a mouse or a rat can chew through that? It's solid steel. It's impossible.
Thank you for your help.
You're welcome. You're welcome. We're very pleased to be able to help you.
She gave us a tour of where her dream home is to be built this spring.
Yeah, but I'm really, really happy right now. Getting a new house, finally.
One house is a drop in the bucket considering the magnitude of the housing shortage, but it's hope for this family.
Calling on my industry colleagues to look into their hearts, look at that tape, forget the commercial motives, forget the money movement, and think about this as a human being. Let's put our heart into this and say, well, what part can I play?
Coming up next week on APTN Investigates, Cullen Crozier looks at a dark chapter in Canadian military history and a controversial malaria drug that some say spurred it on.
Had it not been for mefloquine, this would have never happened, ever.
You're not allowed to test drugs on soldiers in an operational theater.
Our concerns about the drug were basically dismissed in that no real action was taken.